Thanks very much, Margaret, and good morning, everybody. I want to try and put my presentation in a context, and I'm going to focus on the civil service part of the public service because that's what I'm most familiar with. I'm going to look at what I think are some of the successes and some examples of that, and also what I think are some of the main failures that have occurred, and also some of the opportunities. I particularly make the point that, in my view, the OECD Task Force report provides a basis for a new departure in terms of how we look at public service provision. Okay, well, what particularly struck me was that when the economic crisis happened in October 2008, there was immediate focus on the public service as a part of the problem. Dermot Gleeson's comment in the Kenmare Forum in October of that year about lack of competition, restrictive practices in the civil service, particularly struck me. I certainly feel experience shows now they could have done with a bit more restrictive practices in the EIB at the time. And, you know, we've had to deal with that in the past number of years in terms of how it's been perceived. Now, Colin McCarthy looked last night at two trends in terms of spending increases that have got us into the crisis. Now, I think there's a fundamental difference between the spending increases that took place in the 70s and 80s, which were at least in part due to what's often termed the Great Society and the view that the public sector had to expand to meet all of the needs of citizens and the deficits that resulted from that. And what we have today, which is effectively the deficits are a quite different order. They're a mirror image of the collapse in surpluses in the private sector. And, you know, I started negotiating back in the 1970s in the ESB when Keynesianism was still to the fore, and yes, we did live in very inflationary times and negotiated inflationary wage deals, and ultimately public sector debt brought about an end to that era. We now probably have seen a situation where what I would consider market fundamentalism is the belief that the market is always efficient and is always correct. We're seeing the end to that era, correspondingly as a result probably of private sector debt rather than public sector debt. And even if we look back in terms of what we've seen in terms of the banking crisis and the access to lending from other sources throughout the Eurozone that took place, it wasn't as if that wasn't known about. I mean, Patrick Honohan, the current governor of the central bank, identified that in an ESRI report in 2006, but it wasn't perceived as a problem because the view was capital markets are ultimately efficient and it's not problematic in terms of the strengths and the efficiency of the neoliberal model. We now know that that wasn't correct. Now, we also then immediately had a call for wage deflation across the economy as the way out of our competitiveness problem. And my experience of that is that if you look at pay freezes and a wage adjustment through a pay freeze, which is essentially also restoring competitiveness, people can accept that, but they will not accept cuts to their nominal wages unless they're faced with literally a loss of their job. And we've seen the conflict that results from that in the past year or so in terms of attempts to do that. I'll talk a little bit about that later on in terms of, you know, I still don't see evidence of the private sector pay cuts that people have spoken about so much in the media. Now, if we look at the modernisation of the public service in the past decade, I mean, essentially was based on new public management theory, a variant of neoliberalism, replaced the old classic model, command and control, emphasis on integrity, impartiality, fearless advice for public servants to politicians, and sought to bring more private sector norms and values into the equation. That was the idea behind it. In the UK, it was essentially done through privatisation, through more competitive tendering in terms of service delivery. That didn't happen here in Ireland, in large measure because of the social partnership approach, which did provide for, I think, a more consensus-based approach to change in an Irish context. But it was very narrow in its focus. It focused on human resource management changes, things like performance management of individuals, more open recruitment, more competitive promotion, provision for the Secretary-General to be able to dismiss people. The idea being that through performance management and a managerial approach you could leverage up the performance overall in the public sector and lead to better outcomes for citizens and service delivery. We also had focus on customer charters, customer quality service initiatives, but it really was, in its essence, a focus on inputs and process rather than outcomes and outputs. And it's only latterly that we begin to focus on outputs in terms of public service provision. There was a huge expansion of agencies, now over 500 agencies. Again, a view in neoliberal theory that if you separate out discrete functions, you get more efficiency, separate out policy from service delivery, but also a lot of waste, a lot of duplication, every agency having its own pension scheme, its own payroll scheme, and now we're moving back towards a more integrated approach in terms of the public service. Now, that said, although I'm arguing it was a very narrow approach in terms of applying managerial mechanisms, it did actually have real improvements over the past decade. If you look at the revenue commissioners, they reintegrated 3 separate streams, 3 trade union structures and organisations into one integrated stream, better service delivery, more regional structures, a great revenue online service that's very, very efficient, and the tax investigations of the past decade, in my view, could not have been successful without that reorganisation that took place in revenue over the past 10 years. Social family affairs, now called social protection, over the past year the rise in unemployment has led to a much faster way of dealing with unemployment benefit claims, people actually getting appointments and actually getting decisions literally on the spot in some cases in terms of their benefit claims without having to rely on the community welfare officer in terms of temporary payments. Now, as against that, a lot of what you will see in terms of queues outside social welfare offices that have been carried in the media over the past year, they're not actually claimants that are looking for queuing up to get social welfare claims. They're actually people who are required to come on a certain day as a control function to make sure that they're still available for work. And once a month, on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, in every social welfare office, people are required to come up and sign. And in lots of cases, queue in the rain outside the social welfare office because it's not possible to accommodate them in there. Now, that to me is not a citizen focus in terms of what's provided for in terms of public service. I actually think it's an affront to the dignity of the individual citizen that they would be required as a control measure to actually have to queue up in the rain outside a social welfare office. Most people assume they're there actually making a claim. They're not. Passport Office, notwithstanding the recent dispute, absolute excellent service in terms of 10-day delivery in terms of an application for a passport. The queues outside passport offices of the past decade or so, absolutely a thing of the past. Motor tax online, again an innovation that has been of great benefit to citizens. Generally, customer satisfaction surveys for the civil service departments will show 80% plus approval ratings on a consistent basis. Now, the OECD report did 2 things in my view. The OECD came in and looked at the Irish public service and benchmarked it against other OECD countries. Yes, they said there is an increase in numbers, 30% between 1995 and 2007, but from a low base. Third from bottom in spending as a percentage of GDP. If you look at GNP, it's a bit closer to the average. Public sector numbers, 14% or so, 14.6% of the total labour force, relatively low among the OECD. Now, you can argue about the statistics in terms of, well, if you discount for defence spending and issues like that, if you look at other comparisons. But in essence, the OECD report did show that in performance terms and cost effectiveness terms, the Irish public sector overall does not perform too badly. However, in my view, the most important part of the report was the idea of shifting from new public management theory, which is a very narrow focus, which in my view relies too much on economic thinking, and focused on instead the citizen and a broader concept of citizen. I agree with what Don said in terms of customer and user. There needs to be a broader concept of the citizen within the community, within the society, and the citizen having rights. And as I say, in my view, you would not treat people outside a social welfare office the way they're currently treated if you had that citizen-centred approach to public service provision. Also, OECD calling for an integrated approach. Despite what we've done in the past 15 years of creating new agencies, OECD saying there must be more of an integrated approach, something that public servants have no difficulty with, I have to say, and actually would welcome. Also talking about a focus on outputs and outcomes for society, not just inputs and processes. Now, in terms of the Croke Park deal, a lot of the, if you like, financial changes that may result from the Croke Park deal, trade unions are naturally going to look for that as a way of restoring the pay cuts of the past 2 years. That's our job. That's what we're going to do. So I'm not going to say to you here today that that mechanism in the Croke Park is going to suddenly transform public services. I will say to you that insofar as the Croke Park deal puts an emphasis on the implementation of the task force of Secretary Generals who took the OECD report and said, this is how we're going to look at public service provision in the future. I do genuinely believe that that new approach in the OECD report does have a basis for transforming the public service. More citizen-centred, more evidence-based in terms of how you actually look at policy development. Now, it won't be easy to do that in the civil service, to have a citizen-centred approach. The civil service is culturally a very hierarchical organisation. It doesn't deal with change as speedily as maybe it should. Backlogs are sometimes seen by public servants as a normal part of the life in terms of public service provision. So the idea that the individual, if you like, clerical officer on the front line is going to have more discretion, more opportunities for teamwork, more opportunities for initiative, that will not happen. Too easily in the civil service. But if the OECD report is followed through, in my view, that type of change will begin to evolve. If you look at the increase in staffing in the past decade or so in the public service, yes, in terms of health and education, most of the increase has been in that area. Increased provision in terms of frontline staff, in terms of teaching, in terms of doctors, in terms of nurses. And yes, of course, insofar as it was based on transient taxes that are no longer there, there are implications on that for the future. There's no question about that, right? I'm not going to argue otherwise. But if you look at the civil service and look at where the additional staffing came in the civil service, it's very, very top-heavy. All of the staffing increases in the civil service are virtually at the top end. Principal officer, assistant principal, you go down to your basic clerical officer in terms of frontline service provision, the lowest of all. So there are implications in that too in terms of how the civil service rather, sees itself in terms of what's important and how it needs to do its business. Just turning then, if I may, in terms of, okay, we've had successes that I've set out there. Hopefully in the future, in terms of a more citizen-centred approach, the successes can multiply, and in my view they will if that approach is taken. There's also been failures. Right? In my view, the failures have been primarily in the area of policy decisions or policy advice. Was it the policy advice? I don't know that for sure. What I can say to you is, from being, if you like, part of the process over the past decade and having discussions and access to senior civil servants, I don't believe really that anybody thought the policy decisions that were being taken were incorrect. And I'll be await to see if the review of the Department of Finance does show that they gave very significant different policy advice to what was actually followed. So if you look at how we dealt with house prices over the past decade, and I've never been one to think that the failure in terms of the housing and property bubble simply arose after 2004, that we didn't begin to say stop at an early enough stage. If you look at the price increase of the past 2 decades, the difference between the first decade from '87 and the second decade is 100%. That 100% all took place in 3 years, between 1997, 98 and 1999. 30% increases per annum in those 3 years. The solution was supply, supply, supply. House prices on average in Dublin were 4 times average income. The view was now, in future, net income is more important. It created a self-reinforcing bubble in terms of how it was approached. Now, the ESRI was critical of pro-cyclical policy. It was at times critical of housing policy. At other times it says we're really only filling a backlog. Even though we're building houses at a third of what they were doing in the UK, we're only filling a backlog that was there, created a user model of housing that essentially assumed that house prices would continue to rise and therefore they were relatively cheap. So the policy advice that was there didn't really see anything wrong with what was happening. Yes, interest rates came down. Yes, we had good demographics and all of that. But a trajectory was established in the late 90s in terms of the property bubble. So I don't blame the bankers for getting it all wrong. Yes, they engaged in reckless lending, but the policy platform that was set out for the bankers encouraged them to do what they actually did. That's my particular assessment on that. You look at when we joined the euro. Now, Colin McCarthy made the point last night there should have been a bit more debate about what we did in terms of should we or shouldn't join the euro. I'm in no doubt that we should have joined the euro. The problem was, when we did join it, we didn't behave with the discipline that was required for a membership of a single currency. We had to keep inflation within 1.5% of our 3 best performing European partners to get into the euro. In July 1999, 6 months after we joined, inflation was at 1.2%. By November 2000, less than 2 years after we were in the euro, inflation was at 7%. The first pay deal we negotiated after joining the euro, the Programme for Prosperity and Fairness, we negotiated a pay deal for 16%, and we had to renegotiate it to top it up with another 2%. 18% of a pay increase, and we had just joined the single currency. Now, that was not driven by a wage demand. Yes, there were some higher expectations as a result of house prices and the Celtic Tiger boom period, so I'm not saying there were no higher wage expectations, but it was essentially driven by the inflation that was allowed to get out of control within the very short space of 18 months after joining the euro. So the problem wasn't joining the euro. The problem was the lack of discipline that was exercised after we joined the euro. Some argue that it was to do with the drop in the value of the euro after 2000, 2001. I don't buy that argument in total. The euro increased in value in 2006, and yet inflation was resurgent in Ireland at that stage with an increasing value of the euro. So we actually embedded inflation in the economy through a wrong economic policy and through a bubble that was created around the housing property development, and also this view that Ireland was a unique economy, that we had fundamentals different than Europe. And if you look at the 2005 budget speech of the Minister for Finance, where he contrasted the level of spending in Ireland compared to the average in the EU, the level of growth in Ireland compared to the average in the EU, the level of debt, the level of unemployment compared to the EU. We were the star of Europe in terms of the best performing economy. The view was, like the financial sector was seen as a driver of economic growth, the low income tax model, in my view, was seen as a driver of economic growth, when in fact it was simply creating a bubble. And there's still a reluctance to accept. I'm not saying low taxes are bad. Of course, they're good if you can sustain them at that level. But the idea that you can run a low tax economy as a sustainable driver of growth has, in my view, been one of the key policy failures of the past decade. It remains to be seen whether that was perceived by the officials, but nonetheless the political decisions were made. I don't think it's any surprise that a level of Euroscepticism developed in this country, including within the trade union movement, which we have to take some responsibility for, in the context of what was happening. Now, I'm not suggesting in this that we got everything right in the trade union movement. I don't think we did. I'm on record with my colleagues as saying that, in my view, if you look at the low-income tax model we developed for moderate pay increases in the 1990s, it should have been, if you like, at that stage, in the late 90s, we should have recognised it had run out of steam. and we didn't. Instead of that, we continued in the PPF in particular to negotiate on the basis of trading tax increases, or tax reductions rather, in terms of wage increases. Now, if you look at the wage outcomes for 1990s as against the noughties, the actual outcome in real terms is the same. The only difference is that it is at a much higher level of inflation. I just want to finish off briefly by saying, you know, it's customary to sort of blame benchmarking and say major problem in terms of public service pay. Well, the first benchmarking, and it only began to be called benchmarking in the noughties, right, in 2001. But the first benchmarking that took place under social partnership was in 1987, 1988, after social partnership commenced. There were actually two benchmarkings in that period between 1989 and again in 1995. So it wasn't an unusual feature of public service pay determination in terms of comparison with the private sector. What was different about it was there was a lack of transparency for sure, but also it resulted from a huge expansion in private sector pay through a labour market shortage that had been created in the early 2000 period, something we've seen from the level of immigration from Eastern Europe that took place from 2004 onwards. So in that sense, I don't accept, right, that benchmarking is somehow the evil that has been presented in media terms over the past number of years. That's not to say that things aren't going to fundamentally change in the future. I think membership of the euro as a single currency, there was a fundamentally different, incorrect approach taken. And it wasn't just in this country. The idea that balance of payments didn't matter was actually, you know, common across the Eurozone in terms of how it was perceived, stemmed partly from the original Werner report in 1970 on monetary union, which actually set out that balance of payments in terms of the current account didn't matter. We now know that it mattered absolutely fundamentally. Going forward, we're going to have a much different, if you like, form of pay determination within the single currency. National budget constraints within a single currency are going to be very, very different going forward also, in my view. So to sum up then, yes, there was a growth in numbers from a low base within the Irish public sector. It was facilitated by windfall taxes, and insofar as they're gone, significant retrenchment now is a reality. Yes, we have had better service delivery for citizens over the past 15 years, but still some areas that I pointed out, like in the Department of Social Protection, where we really need to see the citizen, not as a consumer or a user, but actually as a member of society and a member of the community, and be treated in a fundamentally different way than they're currently treated. The fragmentation of public service was a waste and duplication, and I'm glad now that we're going to have a more integrated public service going forward from the OECD report. The real failure, in my view, was in the area of policy decisions or advice. I can't say for sure it was advice, but I suspect it was. I've given you two examples of that, house prices and the euro. Having said that, I'm confident that with the Croke Park deal, there is a basis now for going forward in terms of providing some light at the end of the tunnel in getting out of what has been probably the worst crisis ever in this country in economic terms. And certainly I'm confident that the trade union movement will play its part going forward in terms of resolving the crisis that's in this economy and getting it back on an even track. Thank you very much.